Welcome back, everyone. Dan Vega here, and today we're going to be talking about the REST client. I've done a bunch of videos on the REST client, the new client in Spring Boot 3.2 and above, but today we're going to be answering a specific question about the REST client, and it happens to come from a friend here in the Cleveland area, Daniel, and I'll just go ahead and read this to you. Hi, Dan. Hope all is well. Do you know if there's a way or a good way of coming up with setting up some concise request and response logging for the new REST client, which I replied back to, good hearing from you again, Daniel. What information are you trying to capture? And he said, really just the body of the request and the response and the status codes that are associated with it. This is very easy to do with something like Feign. I've seen how to enable the logging of the underlying Apache HTTP client, but that logs far too much detail. And I agree. So there's a way to get at the underlying HTTP client, no matter which one you're using, and go ahead and turn on logging for that. But that is pretty verbose. You'll get a lot out of there. So we're going to do that today. There's a couple different approaches to this. One, you can include the Spring Boot actuator, the new observability support in Spring Boot 3 and above. And any calls kind of made out of the system, those are automatically logged for us. So we can kind of get at those if we need to. But if you just want some concise logging, we want to be able to say, here's the request, here's the response, and here's the status codes. Can we do that within the confines of just the REST client? And the answer is yes. Now, once we read in the response, we can't actually read it in again. And that's because input streams in Java are designed to be read in sequentially. So there is a little bit of a trick to this, and we'll take a look at that as we get into the tutorial. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to build out a project. We're going to talk to a public API. So we'll talk to something like the JSON placeholder service. And that is just an API that we can all read from. And then we'll take a look at two approaches for this. We can, when we set up the REST client, we can inline use a request interceptor and go ahead and read the request in and read the response in and log that out. But this is on a per REST client basis. What if we wanted to use this interceptor for any REST client calls? So what we'll do is we'll end up going in and creating a new class that implements the client HTTP request interceptor interface. And that way, anytime that we kind of set up a REST client, we can just pass this interceptor in there and go ahead and use that. So this will make for a reusable interceptor that we can use across our applications. All right, so to go ahead and get started, all we're going to do is head over to start.spring.io. We're going to create a new project using Java and Maven. Spring Boot 3.3.5 is the current stable. And we'll go ahead and fill in some information about this. We'll say dev.danvega. The artifact will be, let's just call it RCL for request or REST client logging. I'll go ahead and remove that. And then I'm going to go ahead and set up some dependencies here. Actually, the only dependency that we're going to need is Spring Web. This will bring in the support for REST client. We can get a REST client auto-wired in for us using the builder interface, and we have a REST client available to us. So that is all we need to get started. We'll go ahead and click generate. This will download a zip file for us. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. For me, that's going to be IntelliJ's Ultimate Edition. And with that, what are we waiting for? Let's write some code. All right, so we're going to start by creating a post package here. Let's call this post. And inside the post package, we'll create a couple different things. The first thing that we'll need is a post record. So we are going to say new and Java class, and we'll call this post. And this is going to be a record. This is going to represent a post in our system. And we're going to align this up with what is in the JSON placeholder service. I'll show you that in a second. But that's going to have an integer ID, an integer user ID, a title, and a body. So that represents a post in our system. Now what we'll need is a post client. So let's say post client. This is going to be a class, and this is going to be the class that actually makes a call out to the JSON placeholder service. So I'll get a couple of things here. The first thing I'll get is a logger, and then I'll go ahead and declare a variable for the REST client. So we'll call that REST client. We're going to get that through constructor injection. Now, the way to get an instance of a REST client is by using the builder. So there's a builder. I like to call this builder. and then we'll say builder.build. Now, what we want to do is we want to set a base URL here for the service that we're going to talk to. In this case, it's going to be the JSON placeholder service. So if, does that load up? Nope. Let's go ahead and try this. And there's our JSON placeholder service. If you go in here and look at one of the endpoints, there's posts that will have 100 posts. And you can see that's why we modeled the post around it, user ID, title, and body. So everything will line up great. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and make some calls to this if we wanted to. I've done this before. I'm not going to type this out. This, if you've watched some videos on this in the past, this should look pretty familiar. This is a way to get all the posts in the JSON placeholder service, and this is a way to get a single post. Now what we want to do though is actually log the request and response as we make a call to that service. So one way that we can do that, again, is on a per client basis, is by using the request interceptor. So here, when we set up the REST client, there is a request interceptor. So what we do is we can go ahead and get access to the request, the body, and the execution, Dan, and then we can go ahead and do something with it. Now I realize my Copilot is going a little bit crazy, so I'm going to go ahead and disable those completions there. Right? So now what we need to do at the end of the day is we need to return the response. So I could return execution.execute, and that takes in the request and the body. Now again, here's where that tricky part comes in, because you can only read in the response once. Once it's read in, you can't read it in again. So we'll have to find a way around that, and we will once we get to kind of the setting up the interceptor class. But at the very least, what we could do is we could set something up to read or log the request and log the response. So one thing I could do is go ahead and add some methods here. We're going to add one for logging the request, and then we're going to add one for logging the response. If we could go ahead and import that. No. Import and that one. And so now we have these methods to log the request and the response. So we could come in here and say log request. We could pass in the request and the body. So we can pull that in, and then we can say log the response. And this is going to take in the request. And then this also takes in the client HTTP response. Now this is where we would actually need the response. So if we did something like this, now we have the response, we can pass that in. Now, here's where it gets tricky, because we will actually log that out. So we can come down here and in our log response, we could do something like log.info. We can say the response was this, and we can pass in the response, right? But if we do this, what's going to happen is we will actually log the response out successfully. But when we go to actually look at the response, like in the HTTP client, there is no response there, because again, we've read it in already, right? But let's just kind of test this out and see how this works. So I'm going to run the application. I didn't log the request, but we could just put in a logger for that if we wanted to. I'll show you a more complete example when we get to the interceptor. But what I want to do is make a request to HTTP localhost 8080 / we don't have a controller set up. So let's actually do that real quick so that we have something that we can take a look at. And again, I think, if you've followed this channel before, we've done this, so I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of creating this controller. We'll just say this is a post controller, and I will go ahead and copy this in. So this is going to take in the post client, which is a component, right? And now this controller should work. So I'm going to go ahead and restart this. We are going to make a request to /posts. That will give us all 100 posts from our external service. And we'll say /posts. And there are the 100 posts that are coming back. But what you'll notice is in the console, what we're logging out is the class, the response class. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Let's go back to post client. And you see that we just have this response here. Okay, so what we actually want in the response is the response body. Now to get the response body, I'm gonna have to create a byte array. We'll call this response body. And to get that, I'll use the response.getBody .read all bytes. So that'll give us a byte array. So now we can go ahead and output this here. So let's say response body. And let's go ahead and rerun this application. And I'll go back to the terminal. And I'll run this request again. And what you'll notice here is that we don't have a response. We don't have all 100 posts coming back. But if we go over and look at the, well, we're getting this in byte array here, we can easily kind of turn that into a string, right? So we could say new string response. Come on. We want the response body, and this will be a char set of, we can just use the default character set. That should be fine. Or actually, let's just make sure we're using the right one here, Dan. Standard character sets UTF-8. So let's go ahead and rerun that again. We don't want to see the byte array. And let's go ahead and run a curl or an HTTP request to localhost 8080/post. Again, we don't get the response error, but if we look in the logging, it actually logged it out. And again, this is the problem of having to read in the response. Once you read in the response, it's no longer there. So we've read it here. Once we go ahead and return the response back to the client, it can't be read again because it's already been read. So there is a way around this. What we're going to do is kind of cache the body of the response and then return another class that kind of simulates this. So this is one way of doing it. But again, I don't want to get too exhaustive here because I think the other way of doing of creating a class that implements a certain interface will make this a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to leave this in place so that you can kind of see this code. And then what I'll do is we'll create another package here to talk to a different service. So let's go ahead and create a new package called Todo. And inside that package, we're going to create a new record. So let's say new Java class. We'll call this Todo. And this is going to represent a to-do in the system. Again, it's just kind of lining up with the to-do class on JSON placeholder service. Again, we're going to do something similar that we did before with the client. So I'm going to create a new to-do client. And this one, I won't make you watch me go ahead and write this out. We'll get back to this in a second, and then I'll have a to-do controller that we can go ahead and test this from. So I'll say new Java class to-do controller, and this will give us that. So the error that we're getting there is because we don't have this client logger request interceptor. So what we want to do is create a new class. And for it to be a request interceptor, it needs to implement a certain class, which is the client HTTP request interceptor. So what I want to do is create a new class. So let's say, no, why is my generate not helping? That's okay. Let's go in here, new Java class, and I'm going to call this the client. Actually, let's call this, I think I called it the client logger. So let's say Java class client logger request interceptor. And this is going to be a class, and it's going to implement the client HTTP request interceptor. And basically, this is what we're using when we did this inline before. Because it's a functional interface, we were able to just use a Lambda expression right there in line. But for this one, we got to implement the method, and there is that single intercept method, which is the one we used before, that takes in the request, the body, and the client execution. So we have those same things available to us. But now what we're going to do is, again, make this work so that we can read in the request more than once, because we want to be able to use that body in the response, but we still need to return that response back to the client. So let's create a logger. We'll have that. And then what we're going to do is in here, we are going to say log request. So this is going to take in the request and the body. Then what we are going to do is get the response the same way we did before. So we'll call execution.execute. This takes in the request and the body. And then we'll return a response variable for that. And then finally, what we're going to do is we are going to return the result of our log response method, which we will build out in a second. And that's going to take the request and the response. So let's see how we can kind of get past this. The first thing I'm going to do is put in the log request method. This is going to log the request. So it's going to say, here's the method, here's the URI. We're going to log headers. If the body.length is greater than 0, here is the actual request. Now I've split the log headers out to a separate method because we will use that in both the request and the response. So that will give us our request. Now our response is going to be a little bit different, right? So we have our request here. We have a private, which is going to return a client HTTP response, because that is the contract for this method. For our intercept method, it needs to return this client HTTP response. And we'll call this log response. This will take in the HTTP request. We'll call this request. And then we have the client HTTP response. And this is response. So the first thing that we're going to do is we can just log out some info. So let's say that the response status was, and then we can use the response.get status code. So there's kind of our, a way to get into the status code there. Then what we need to do is we want to log the headers. So log headers. And this takes in the response.get headers. All right, so far so good. Now we're going to do something we did before, which is use the response to get the body, right? And from the body, we're going to read in all of the bytes. So that will give us a byte array that we can use. And I think I called that response body. Let's do that again. And so now we have the response body. Okay, so here's where, well, actually, we'll do the same thing we did before, right? We will check the response body. If there is a length to that, we will go ahead and log that out. Okay, so this is pretty much everything we've done before. But now we need a way to like capture the actual response so that when we return this back here, it contains the response body. Because right now that response body is empty. We've read it in already. We cannot do anything with that. So I am going to paste this in. This is going to be let's see here. This will be a private static class called a buffering client HTTP response wrapper, which implements that client HTTP response. So now if we've create kind of an instance of this, then this is of this type, and that will satisfy the contract of returning a client HTTP response. So what we can do here when we return the, that's the request response. So when we return the response, what we really want to return is that buffering client HTTP response wrapper. So we can say return new buffering client HTTP response wrapper. And sorry for the in the way there. So that's going to take in the response and the response body. Because what that ultimately does is take in the response and the body and really just stores the body in a new byte array input stream. Because again, input streams can only be read once. Once it's there, it's gone. But now we're basically creating a new byte array input stream. And then we have, what is going on here? This should just throw an exception, which it does. Overrides method that is directed. Okay. Yeah, that's okay though. Cool. So I think that will give us everything we need. Now, if we go back to our to-do client, this should be no more red squigglies. Could not auto wire. Okay, that's okay. We did not mark this with add component yet. So that looks like that should be okay. Okay, so now what we do when we make a call to the to-do controller, let's go back over here and look at the to-do controller, and we make a call to find all, so /to-dos. It's going to get all of the to-dos in the system, but it should return them back to the client while also logging them out. And again, the beauty about this is we just use this single line at .request interceptor. We pass in this custom class that we've used. And again, you can reuse this in every project that you use. But more importantly, every REST client that we kind of create in the system can use that request interceptor to basically log out the request, the response, and the headers. So let's go ahead and try this. Let's go ahead and rerun this application. I'll go back to the terminal. We're going to make a call to localhost 8080 /to-dos. And we see all of the to-dos coming back. If we go back over to the console, we also see the to-dos being logged here. So let's go back up. We should see more. So here is the headers. So we got the headers coming in. A whole bunch of headers here being logged, and then the request should be in there as well. So we see like content length. Here's the request. It's a GET request to this particular URI. And now we start to have the basics of all of the logging that we wanted to do. So again, I'm not going to rerun this, but if you wanted to, you can come over to post client then and basically replace this with that client logger request interceptor. And now this is a class that you can reuse over and over again. So friends, Daniel, first off, thanks for that question. I hope you found this useful. If you did, do me a big favor, leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.